Welcome to our second day of the Nexus conference, and if for some reason you missed yesterday, I think I understand the videos of the plenary sessions are up on the website, and we have a newsletter for the conference which either you will have got or you can get again from the website. So we're communicating. There'll be some photos up from each of the sessions as well. So we're trying to cover our multimedia approach to the conference and ensure that people hear about it. But today, this morning, I have the pleasure to introduce Paula Caballero Gomez, who is the Director of Economic, Social and Environmental Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombia. I had the pleasure to first meet Paula in Solo, Indonesia in July 2011, where she placed on the table, with the support of Guatemala, the idea that we need to develop sustainable development goals. And the chair's summary from that meeting, from that first time that sustainable development goals were to some extent put on the table, said that there was a significant interest on the discussion on sustainable development goals in the context of goals related in particular to sustainable energy goals advanced by the SDGs advisory group. There was a feeling that negotiating specific goals would bog down negotiations. Who were they to know that was so true? But we are a few years later. However, they may be a good chance for an agreement in principle in the development of sustainable development goals. And as many of you know, that we've gone through the Rio+20 process where we saw sustainable development goals put on the table, and it was one of the real important outcomes from that conference, and has now become, to some extent, the guiding principle to the new goals that will take the place, incorporating, of course, the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. As you all know as well, the Sustainable Development Goals Open Working Group was meeting earlier in this week, and we're very fortunate to have a number of the negotiators who've come here, as well as Paula. But at the front of taking forward the Sustainable Development Goals process from that meeting in Solo, but also in the process in the SDG Open Working Group, has been Paula and her leadership. And it's enabled, I think, a real opportunity to move us in the direction of addressing development both in the north and the south. There is no, I think, difference. There is no different way of doing it than having sustainable development. There is no development that isn't sustainable or can be in the future. And I think one of the other really interesting things from the process for Rio+20 and the SDGs has been, to some extent, the transfer of leadership from the north to the south. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, and China have actually led the way in kind of moving forward in a more progressive and positive way. Paolo, can I ask you to come up and introduce the political part of the conversation?
Good morning, everybody, and many thanks to Felix and to the organizers of the conference. We welcome opportunities to talk with as wide a range of stakeholders as possible on how we should take this process forward and where it is that we want to land in 2015 so that we have a useful tool going forward. I just want to check, if I press these little buttons here, this thing will move? What? No, I found this. Okay, bear with me. Technology is not my strength. Okay, so I'm addressing this presentation in various forms and ways. I've been giving around the world in different settings. So if you've seen parts of it, I apologize. But I think that consistency in the messaging is important. I'm addressing a group of people that don't need to be convinced. I'm fairly sure that I'm preaching to the converted in this audience. But I think that we've done a very poor job of communicating these issues that we care so much about broadly. So part of what we need to do is to explain to people why this approach is necessary. This proposal that Colombia put forward, not just the SDGs, but this idea of the integrating approach, has been taken up by many. And at the outset, I would like to recommend very strongly to you a paper by the Stockholm Environment Institute that further unpacks this idea of the integrating approach, specifically with relation to the Nexus. So it's a very good resource. So there's all these reasons why we need development, a development framework or a development tool such as the SDGs. And the one point I wanted to make here is that development is not a zero-sum game. There's not this dichotomy between environment or sustainability versus economic growth or versus social inclusion. We know that it is all part of the same. But as I say, we have to be much better at explaining why. So why we need a new approach is first and foremost poverty eradication. And we've all agreed it's the moral imperative of our time. And believe you me, Colombia is completely committed to this. We have an agency that is already breaking the targets we had self-imposed within our government to eradicate poverty, and in particular extreme poverty. So this is front and center of the agenda, but it's not enough. The real problem is how we're going to deliver well-being to 9 billion plus by 2050. And not just 9 billion plus poor people, but if we're successful, this global emerging middle class has consumption patterns that are not sustainable. I often say we should stop talking about the poorest or rich countries, poor countries, north, south. We have to start talking about quintiles. And all of us here are part of that top quintile. And so we need to figure out what happens as we actually manage to get the bottom quintiles to move into a more dignified lifestyles, into prosperity, and what impacts that can have on resource use. And that's the real reason why we need to be so diligent and why there's such a small window of opportunity for changing consumption and production patterns, for really embarking on economic models, green growth or whatever you want to call them, that will enable us to stay within those planetary boundaries. And this obviously before we start talking about greenhouse gases, before we start talking about climate change. Now there's a new concept, there's new concepts I'm going to introduce. I wanted to bring a few surprises for Felix here. And this is a new concept that I'm working with, and I call it receding reality. You can call it also receding normality. Fisheries is the best example. 100 years ago, the average catch or the average size of X fish was this big. And it starts to diminish. It just starts to diminish. And now the average size is this. And when you get a fish that's this big, you go, oh, wow, did you see the fish? But we forget that 100 years ago, the norm was this. We talk about slow onset events like climate change, like sea level rise. I'd like to think that environmental degradation, that the degradation of our air, of our waters, of our cities, of our general environment is also a slow onset event. And that's what I call receding reality. And we have to bring that to the table because it's the slow onset degradation, if you will, also, that we also have to tackle. And it's insidious because it's not so visible. So we need to go beyond an agenda of minimums to a much more structured, deep, transformative agenda, which is what the SDGs are about. And we need to go for a universal agenda. Here in this setting, I can't unpack universality, but again, there's two very good papers out on universality that I would recommend. One was written by Kitty van der Heijden, Peter Hazelwood, and I collaborated on that. And the other one is a recent paper out by Kitty van der Heijden, and I can give all the links to Felix. Okay. So, these are more benefits of why you need the SDGs. Visibilizing, as I say, or rendering visible the linkages between sectors and issues, between the three dimensions. And very critical, because I know there's a lot of civil society, private sector out here in this audience, making sure that you can input into this process. We're very concerned that this is not a government process. I think Paul Polman said it most beautifully when he addressed the Open Working Group. He said, governments, you can't do this alone, and guess what? That's the good news. It is the good news. You look at examples like Gavi. And this is the kind of collaboration and of partnerships that we need. That's why we need the SDGs, to bring us beyond the politicized, fairly useless conversations we sometimes have at the UN. And it's about concrete needs. It's about implementation. It's about addressing really and truly what you need. And at the end, you'll see how you can measure this. And it's a new indicator that is called the M&M indicator that I'll explain at the end. So this slide is obviously not for you, the experts, but it's the kind of slide that I think we need to put up. It's the kind of information we need to have there. And it's, for example, what I call about the myth of renewables. Out there, there's a sense that, water is infinite, energy is just a question of, that there is not really a limit, and there's a lot of resistance to concepts like planetary boundaries. This information I've taken from Thirsty Energy, a fantastic World Bank initiative, and it evidences, for example, the linkages between water and energy. It's not just that so many people are thirsty or that such percentage of the population is living in a water-stressed conditions and how many more will be expected by 2030. It's the fact that the trade-offs between resources need to be made evident. And this kind of information is the kind of information that we have to put out there to get people to understand why we need an approach like the SDGs. So what is the proposal about? It's about focusing initially on targets. And this has created some confusion because Colombia has spent, 2.5 years talking about goals, and now all of a sudden we're saying, okay, forget the goals, let's talk about targets. But we do need to talk is about the targets. And the key word here, I don't know if I can get this thing to point, but the word mainly, we're not being dogmatic, and we shouldn't be dogmatic. It's mainly bottom up, but not exclusively. The point is to start substantively from the start. And if you start on goals, you'll see what happens. So what is the reality on the ground? How can we get beyond the rhetoric? So this is business as usual. I want these goals. I call it the silo approach, the little gray boxes, the little gray glasses. And we put on our little gray glasses and decide that this is how reality needs to look. And then obviously we have our own ideas about what should go under those little gray boxes. We have lots of little smaller gray boxes. And this is what we're wedded to, and this is our vision of the world. Note, obviously, that there's no interaction between all the little boxes. They're just there. There's little gray armies of thoughts and concepts that are completely marginalized and separate from each other. And so we end up with a lot of Christmas lists. This is what I want, and this is what I'm going to bring to the table, and by God, it better stay on that table. And this is how we do business. This is what the normal SDG negotiations can look like. And let me tell you that there's still a very big possibility that this could happen. It's not, we're not by a stretch out of the woods. So this is a very simple diagram I've put together to try to lead into the next slide. We have the Nexus, and we have three nice issues, right? Water and food and energy, and you don't know. Again, this is not for an audience such as yours, but I want us to think about how we can convey message. So we're going to have a nice structured, disciplined conversation about this. So we start talking about integrated water resource management, and then maybe delve into things like irrigation or sanitation. But life gets really complicated the minute you start to go a little bit deeper. And you start to not be very clear about what is a trade-off, what are the linkages, what is a target, what is a goal, where's the feedback loop. This before you start talking, obviously, about climate change and climate change scenarios. And this is what it looks like. This was effort done. We had the Independent Resource Forum is a consortium of 12 think tanks from North and South. And they're working, several governments are working closely with them. And we had a retreat where we tried to figure out how to approach the creation of the SDGs, the structuring. And this is what it looked like. These were groups of 8 experts, some real world-class experts, a couple of real-class diplomats, a bunch. But it wasn't a negotiation. We're trying to get our heads around it. And this is what it looked like after 3 hours of intense discussion, right? This is a trade-off. Some of the little lines are trade-offs. The other ones are synergies. The other ones are this. There was discussions, what exactly is the goal? What is the target? This was a really good effort to try to get your heads around it. Clearly, You can't do that with 194, and particularly you can't do that if it's not 194, but all of you are part of the conversation, which is where it should be. So let me introduce you to 4 characters. This is, I don't need to have all these caveats here, but in other settings I do. Colombia is not saying that these are the goals. These are just examples. These are little cartoons that we put up there instead of like Mickey Mouse or, Calvin and Hobbes. This is what they look like. So this is my introduction to the characters we're going to see in the next slides. So what is Colombia proposing? We say, let's start with the targets. The targets are pretty much out there already. We know what they look like. There's targets been proposed by UN agencies, by different specialty groups, by friends of this and friends of that. And the reason that there's like these color combinations is because, as I said before, it's mainly bottom up, but we know we know where we're going to land. Water, health, inclusive growth. It really and truly is not rocket science. What we're asking, which is the first part of the revolution, is that we look at it from a multidisciplinary approach. That we don't just focus on each specific issue, each target, with those little gray glasses that we saw at the beginning. And so what would this look like? Here we have these we've pulled out. Seriously, my team, I just said, take 3 targets from the high-level panel report and whip them up there. And they chose them. The first time I gave this presentation, I hadn't seen these targets before in this context, right? And you could do this with any target, and I'll demonstrate that later. So here is this target on, child malnutrition. This is always, in our little gray world, part of food security. But it's not. Sure, it's a food security target, but it's also clearly a health target and a food security target. And we always talk about the need for equity, right? That's one of the new big catchwords. Well, I defy everybody in this audience in like 2 minutes to come up with the targets for an equity goal. What would that look like? Well, this is an equity goal. This is the best kind of equity goal. This is an intergenerational equity goal, right? And we're not seeing it. Because if we have our little gray glasses, we don't realize that this is the intergenerational equity goal. Let's try another one just on for size. Agricultural productivity again. It's food security, right? Clearly it is food security. But it's not really. It's not only. It also has to do with employment, with water, with food security, and very importantly, also with equity. This is critical if we're going to talk about the disparity and reducing the disparity between the urban and the rural settings. So there's another equity target. Hey, we hadn't, when we had our little gray glasses on, we hadn't seen an equity target that was looking at us all the time. Bringing fresh water withdrawals in line with supply. Okay, here we have about sectoral water use efficiency. Again, in the little gray world, it is a water target. It's part of the I need this because it's a water target. But it's not. It's a whole lot of other things, and there's world-class experts, water experts in this room. You can probably come up with 10 linkages that are incredibly relevant, both to issues and to sectors. So when we take off the gray glasses, a whole world opens up that we hadn't seen before. And that's what sustainable development is about. It's seeing the connections. If you don't see the connections, you don't have that. So how could we go about this? And obviously the next slides are just sort of very schematic and simplistic, but you have the targets, as I say, we have gazillion targets out there. And you can start to zero in and say, for example, we're going to start looking at water-related issues, and you start to bring them together. But from that multi-dimensional perspective, taking off your little gray glasses, and lo and behold, we can actually create a water goal. But what's important is that all the little balls under that water goal are not blue with a little drop, because this is about integration. This is what multi-dimensional, multi-everything that we like to talk about, this is what it would look like. So, well, I'm sort of overstating the point here that you can do it for others. But the second part, or the third part at this point of the revolution, is this, that you can share goals across targets. You can have the same target across several goals. So when you are telling me, for example, gender has to be cross-cutting and has to be mainstreamed, and it has to be standalone, and water has to be da-da, and all these other issues that have to be both, well, you can have your cake and eat it too. There is such a thing as a free lunch here. Because if you have the shared targets, you're also being able not just to actually articulate the interlinkages, but to reduce the number of targets. And what's most important, and this, I'm going to come back to the M&M indicator at the end, what's most important is that this would make sense back home. When I bring this home, it will enable, for example, the Ministry of Health to be telling the Ministry of Finance that they need to finance and provide greater funding for integrated watershed management because water quality depends on... That conversation isn't happening. That would be the revolution. So again, overstating the obvious. It's nice to watch the little balls move around. Okay, you remember that earlier poster? Well, this is what happened at the end. Somebody said, but Paula, you know, the way we're doing it is not your proposal. Let's try it on for size. This took us 10 minutes. We didn't finish because we'd run out of time by then, but all the little green balls at the top are stickers. We won the competition. I mean, this poster won. This was the one that made the most sense. Nobody could figure out, even those of us who participated in each poster, we couldn't really quite explain it because it was just too convoluted. This was really simple, and it made sense. So, what are we proposing is basically this. You group the targets ground up. That way, also, you depoliticize issues. A lot of people will have, and constituencies and countries will have pet issues that don't really fit. But this way we can have a structured, informed discussion, and 3 things can happen. Well, many things can happen, but 3 could. One is that you discuss a target and you say, this is a real outlier. You know, it's really important for you, but do we really want to bring it into a global setting? Not really, so we get rid of it. An informed discussion. It might be political, but it's a sensible discussion. Others we might say, we have to, that's important, but let's reformulate it. And actually reformulate it, it's really important. And others, we might say, okay, this has to become a goal. But at that point, because we're doing it ground up and sensibly, we will know that we have 17 or 27 goals on the table, and we'll have to decide, do we really want goal 28 or 18 or whatever it is? Do we really want to dilute the effect of the whole by having a whole new goal? And maybe the answer is yes, but it's an informed discussion. It's not, you know, bartering. So, moving forward, what we're asking is basically that, as I say, without being dogmatic, we focus largely on the targets and not so much on the goals. And I don't know if that's going to happen, quite honestly. Let me tell you that we decided to try this on for size in Colombia. You know, practice what we preach and see what happens. It's been wildly successful. It's been so successful that the Ministry of, well, the National Planning Department has taken over the exercise, and they're seeing it as a major input to the new National Development Plan. We have elections in May, and they're coming up with a whole new 4-year plan. And what happened was that people, you know, we sat with all the ministries, and we all agreed, after they understood this approach, that it was pointless to ask for a goal for each sector, because that wasn't the point. That the real interest was in targets. So we asked every ministry to come up, you know, it's like, okay, you are the expert, right? You know about whatever it is, but you are the expert. You tell me what are the 3 targets that are the most important for you, for your sector or your issue that will transform. And you, what are your 3 targets? And so forth and so on. So the ministries did their groundwork, came back and reported, you know, that it had been an amazingly rich exercise for them. And they brought these targets. And we started to look at them. And there was this one fantastic moment when the Ministry of Mines was saying, well, my 3 targets, and everybody was expecting, you know, how much, you know, coal they were going to export. And they said, what we really need to do is formalize the sector. And it was like a bombshell. Immediately, all the other ministries started saying, but that's my goal too, and I need this. And all of a sudden, this target, which in the little gray glass world would have been a mining target, became a government target, became a national target. And we started to do that. We never managed to get in the first rounds past 3 targets because there was so much enthusiasm around each target that we couldn't get beyond the basic conversation. And that's what we're doing right now. We have a big setting, and we've broken up. We break up into tables and do this sort of World Cafe thing, and we start going around. And so all the different ministries talk about all the targets, and it's changing how people see and understand how they can work with each other, where what is really theirs, and what's theirs becomes ours because we add up to much more than the sum of the parts, i.e. development is not a zero-sum game. So, you know, lots of benefits that you can see for yourselves, but the most important is the last one. It's about implementation. If we do it this way, we will be able to come up with something that we can implement that makes sense. So we need to get the metrics right, and that also means accounting for the differences. And that's the second part of this presentation. It's the other proposal we put forward with Guatemala, the dashboard approach, which is fully complementary with the integrating approach. Because there are huge differences along the development spectrum, and we have to understand how we can bring that into a universal agenda. So this is an agenda that has to be globally agreed. It has to be relevant for all countries, reflect common aspirations for humanity, and include basic human needs, i.e. the MDG targets have to be brought into this. No question about it. How do we do that? So if we're going to have an agenda that delivers on equity and on differentiation, that delivers on equity, we need to provide for differentiation, but we need to do so in a way that's not highly politicized, because otherwise we're going to just have a train wreck in New York, or such an agenda of minimums that it will not be useful for you, private sector, or for you, civil society, for the ministries, or for anybody. It won't be the revolution that we have in the making, that we have right almost within our grasp. It won't be that revolution. Why do we need differentiation? There's global challenges. There are issues that are difficult, not just climate change, but enablers or drivers, things like trade and financial systems. And because there are very real specificities that need to be taken into account. Colombia itself is a development spectrum. We have parts of the country that are quote unquote first world and parts of the country where, you know, we have abject poverty. And that inequality is something that keeps us up at night. And, you know, we're making a little bit of headway with our genies. But globally, it's a huge issue. And it's a huge issue because if you're talking about equality and equity, it's not just within countries, it's also between countries and between generations. So what it doesn't mean, from Colombia's perspective, this does not mean that every target has got to be implemented by every country. You know, if there's a target that cannot be implemented by everybody, then it's not relevant. It does not mean that. And it also doesn't mean that you have to prejudge and say, well, some countries will have to do this target and, you know, a 2-tier, a 5-tier, or whatever tiered approach. That doesn't work because, like I say, Colombia, we have a whole development spectrum within our own borders. We're a lot of different countries. And the same can be applied for many other countries. And things change. Look at what's been happening with the financial crisis and which countries are coming up and down. You know, things change. Things evolve. What it does mean is that we need an agenda that provides for global coherence, that has a capacity to address global level issues, that has minimum standards, and that has comparability and aggregation at global level and regional levels. This is important. But that you tailor it and that you really articulate that linkage between poverty and sustainability. So it's a combination of bottom-up and top-down. So what are we calling for here? Really simple. We agree on goals, and each set of goals has, each goal has a set of targets and indicators. By the way, parenthetically, in New York at this point, we don't expect to get to the indicator level, which makes this part of the proposal very difficult, because differentiation will happen at a level that we're not going to be addressing in the political discussions. So each country would decide the speed and level for each target. That's where the differentiation comes in. Yes, you can have globally aspirational targets. You know, X percentage of the global energy mix will be renewable. But countries will each decide to what extent and how they can contribute to that. A small island or a small nation state might not be really that keen on or able to contribute much to renewable energy, but they might do to energy efficiency, right? The defining parameter is relevance. Tajikistan is probably not going to be interested in a target on sustainable fisheries. That doesn't mean we don't have a target on sustainable fisheries. Switzerland might not have an issue with primary education. That doesn't mean we don't put it there. There will be different ways and manners of participating, which is why where the whole issue of partnerships comes in. And obviously we can't address that here, but I'm sure it'll come in later. And in addition to this, country can come up with their own targets. With the MDGs, Argentina came up with their own MDG targets and goals because they needed that for their national level processes. Did any of you know about that? Did it affect how any other country had implemented the MDGs? No, no, and no again. It doesn't matter. Each country can take this, and if they need to have additional goals and targets, that's fine at national level. But globally, we have a core set. So there's, this is again, as I say, this is the kind of slide that I left up there. It's not very relevant for this audience, but it's the kind of thoughts and issues that we need to talk about and understand what are the differences and what are the concerns. And these are gross generalizations, but it's just to say that, we have to understand where different countries might be coming from. So this is a really, really simplistic example, but it's a really good one. So this is, I'll let the experts then unpack it further. But this is sort of what we're talking about. Let's imagine that we have a target on food security and nutrition, and from what I've heard over the past days, and sustainable agriculture, right? And then you would have a target on reducing food waste and loss by X percentage, whatever. We're not going to get to the numbers in New York at this point. But then it's at the indicator levels that you would really start to unpack. Is it at the harvest stage or the production? Is it in storage? Is it in consumption? Where are we wasting food? Where is there that post-harvest loss? And it will change. For some countries, the issue might be almost entirely about consumption. For others, everything that's produced is consumed, and it's really about the fact that there's no capacity for storage, and there's a whole lot of... So each country will see, but it's a core set of indicators for each target. So countries sort of figure out which is relevant. Which is relevant for me right now? And Colombia might say, this is really relevant for me right now, but I'm going to have a target, I'm going to adopt also an indicator with a really long time span because I can see that this is coming my way and I want to prepare for it, or I want to avoid it. So I want to put it on the political agenda so that we're aware of it and plan for it. There's many different ways this can be unpacked to be relevant to national development processes. And that's why you also need that differentiation. If it doesn't make sense for my ministries, they're not going to do it and they're not going to pay attention to it. So the countries would determine the baseline, milestones, and speed. We've been talking about baselines for some years now. Countries have to understand where they are now to know what they can sign up to. And then you adjust it per country. It still can be aggregated. It's still coherent. UN Statistical Commission can tell each country how to do this, what's happening, and work to build up the statistical capacity. So these are benefits of the dashboard approach. And as you can see, it's absolutely and fully complementary with the integrating approach. This, I don't know if you saw that, it popped up here, getting the metrics right matters. The previous presentation, the last presentation on this I gave at the UN, I had that popping up all over the place because I wanted to have like the subliminal messaging. Because if we don't get the metrics right, none of this will matter. So these are more benefits of why we think it's important: cooperation, capacity building, sharing, exchange of experiences, support, particularly, as I said, capacity building for statistical capacity, et cetera, right? And one of the big concerns I keep hearing is that it's going to be a race to the bottom. I don't think it's a race to the bottom. If you get the metrics right, it won't be a race to the bottom. For the very simple reason that if we get it, it's going to be, and if it's really that revolutionary, countries and organizations and enterprises, companies will use it. GDP was never obligatory. There's no GDP convention. There's no MDG convention, and people use it. Why? Because it makes sense, because it's useful. Now, if we come up with a dog's breakfast in New York, it won't be useful, and we won't be able to sell it. But we won't even have to sell it if we get it right. And getting it right means not just few goals, it means few targets. I'm very scared. I've been hearing talk about sub-goals. So what that would look like is we would have these huge goals, you know, which are these massive political statements where you over-cluster everything you want to hear, right? Inclusive sustainable development is gender sensitive and takes into account, you know, every single different type of stakeholder and everything. You can imagine what that could start, language could. Then under that you have goals, which they call sub-goals. Then under that you have real goals, which are what they call targets. And then because you can't really do that, there's still no action, it's all, you know, 3 levels and 3 layers of political statements, then you get down to the target level. And by that point, you have 400 targets or more, right? We could have that in New York. So what is the M&M indicator? That's the indicator of success. And that's the indicator that we are proposing, that we all take home and measure, and you measure what's happened in New York by. The first M stands for ministers, as I said before. If when I go home with whatever we agree in New York, my Ministry of Transport, of Finance, of Health, say, wow, this is great, this helps me to take it forward, I can really work with this, then it's successful. And the other M is quite simply my mother, and your mother, and your mother. Mainstream. Can mainstream understand what we're talking about? We talk about compelling, easy to understand, you know, all these adjectives and all these descriptions we have of why the MDGs worked. Code language for that is just, can my mother understand it? Does it make sense for her? So if ministers and mothers can understand what we agreed to in New York, we will be successful. But there was another version of M&M that I heard yesterday, which is the last thought I want to leave you with. Mobilize the masses. So help us mobilize the masses so we get it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. We've got time for some questions, but before we do that, and you know if you want to ask questions, there are 2 mics, 1 on each side of the room, I think. So go and stand by the mic if you want to ask a question. Thank you. Paula mentioned the SEI briefing document. Johan, put your hand up again, Johan, has 30 or 40 of those. If you want to come and get them after the session, then please do so, and we'll also put it up on the website so you can download it. So if anyone, does anyone have a question to Paula? Franz? Introduce yourself first.
Franz Verhagen of the International Institute for Monetary Transformation. But I will not ask a question about monetary transformation, but about this SDGs and the feasibility of making, let me put this thing a little bit here, and the feasibility of having the SDG become Sustainable Communities Development Goals. You were talking about mobilizing the masses. So much of the terminology of sustainable development is ambiguous, and that is also its attraction, and that made it possible to come into currency. But if we were to start thinking in terms of sustainable communities development, then you would have, then we were to start where it really matters. Mainstream, your mothers, etc., etc. So I was wondering what you would think about this change of sustainable development into sustainable communities development.
Okay, we have another question on the other side.
Yeah, Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative. Paula, it's always a pleasure to listen to your insights. I just had a question, though, on a couple of your slides. You indicated that it's not a zero-sum game, that we're really looking for mutually beneficial opportunities. But then you also talk about receding reality. And I think some people might argue that receding reality is, in fact, a verification that we are in a zero-sum game and that we're exceeding our resource use. I'm wondering how you would deal with that kind of an argument. Thank you.
Thank you. As always, Ed is a very deep analysis of all the presentations we put forward, and I thank you for that, Ed. And yes, I know that you're thinking about resource efficiency and all of that. It's true. There's 2 ways of looking at it. But when I say it's not a zero-sum game, it's more of a political statement in the sense that there's a sense that sustainable development will stand in the way of economic growth. It's the reason why we had these huge discussions about green growth, and green growth was seen as, you know, imposing conditionalities on growth. It's why we have these big discussions right now in, well, one of the many reasons in climate change that this is going to constrain policy options, et cetera, for growth. You know, it's encapsulated in that lovely little statement, you know, grow now. What is it? Grow now, clean up later. And you can see what's happening where they did grow now and they're trying to clean up later, right? We've seen the images from many cities, for example, around the world with unmanageable pollution levels. So the sense of that it's not a zero-sum game is trying to evidence the fact that there's not this sort of false dichotomy between growth and sustainable development, that you can't do one without the other. And that if you take the SDGs, you will be able to plan better precisely for finite resources. That's why I talk about also the myth of renewables, right? It's the sense that, you know, water is a renewable, so we can squander it. Well, it's not that renewable, and I'm not just talking about fossil aquifers. And if you have so many competing demands for that single resource, how are you going to allocate the uses? And how are you going to invest? And how are you going to make sure that 20 years down the line, you haven't put in place all this hard infrastructure at great cost that becomes a stranded asset or that locks you into completely unsustainable trajectories? So it's only when you start to see the bigger picture and make those linkages that you can minimize the trade-offs. You can identify many win-win opportunities. A lot of mitigation actions, for example, have adaptation co-benefits. And in that sense, it's not a zero-sum game, which doesn't mean that there are not finite resources, which doesn't mean that there is not a receding reality. There is. That's why it's all the more important that we don't see it as just black and white, and either you grow or you pollute. And unbelievably, there's still huge numbers of very thoughtful and intelligent people out there, and communities and constituencies that still see the environment as something other, which is why many, for example, are concerned about having an SDG on environment, because it's just going to be an outlier. You know, I call it the panda and the mermaids. And it's not about the panda and the mermaids. We made that point very strongly in the pre-last open working group, where we put up a poster showing a lot of people and saying, yes, this is a people-centered agenda, but hey, guess what? These people live on a planet and they need these ecosystems. So it's bringing that together. And in terms of communities, of course, we have to start to understand sustainability at many levels. And I'm not sure if by communities you mean communities of practice, which are just as important as physical communities. So yes, absolutely, mobilizing the masses means not only just getting everybody to understand it, but also trying to get everybody to understand what it means for them and what are the added benefits for them. We have to start to unpack this and unpack it particularly for private sector. Private sector doesn't exist. You know, it's a construct. Are we talking about transnational corporations or the SMEs that are generating all the jobs? So let's unpack also what we understand by communities, and by all means, you know, we have to take this forward in ways that are relevant.
Okay, we've got 4 questions, which is about all we're going to be able to take before the change of things. So, do you want to go next?
We might be able to take, depending on the complexity, just 2 and 2.
I was going to do that.
Oh, good. Thank you, Felix. I can always count on you.
Thank you. Andrew Scott from the Overseas Development Institute. First of all, Paula, allow me to say thank you on behalf of the Independent Research Forum for your acknowledgement of the work that they've done, and it's great to see that their work has helped with thinking within the Open Working Group. My question to you is more about the implementation side. Here at this conference, I think we're going to be hearing a lot of discussion and questioning about implementation, and particularly how do you get currently siloed institutions to be able to work together to pursue the integrated approach that we're talking about. I was just wondering whether or not you could lend us any thoughts that you might have about how the kind of approach that you've introduced into Colombia might be rolled out in other countries, and how that might be pursued either by the working group or by other organizations working alongside it.
Okay.
Well, I'm Joachim von Braun, Center for Development Research in Bonn, Germany.
I think the framework which you presented to us makes a lot of sense. My question also is on the implementation side, and what role at global and what at local levels there. If you look at what today are the major drivers of poverty, the causes of, you quickly identify discrimination, exclusion, political contexts, and not just the lack of access to type of issues. Where does this come in? What role for global action? What role for who defines the indicators which lead us to deeper causalities rather than superficial monitoring of symptoms? I think there we have a danger, and I'm a bit worried that you say New York will not get to that. So somehow we need a global discourse, I would propose, on the appropriate hard-hitting indicators, and I wonder how you would pursue that.
Thank you. I think I'll go backwards again this time. There's lots of very intense ongoing discussions right now about the scope of the framework that we're going to agree and the role of governance and rule of law and peace and security. So that discussion is still happening. But I think that there's a broader understanding of the fact that you need to factor in drivers and enablers, and that was one of the limitations of the MDGs. It was sort of end hunger, but you don't really know how, or deal with slums, but it doesn't really talk about the how, the economic, the social drivers. So I think that there's more of an understanding of that. The full answer to your question is unfortunately very much in the political sphere, and that's how it's going to play out in New York. But I think that if we could have this kind of an approach, start to unpack it, and that's where you really need to depoliticize it. So if we could have a sensible discussion about why, access to justice is important, not as a concept, not as some, political construct, but really understanding it. If we could understand, what is the issue of legal identity and what it means to a person's lives, and, what successful examples you have, and where private sector might want to pitch in and really help X, Y, Z country or community or whatever make progress in this, the conversation changes. So particularly for that kind of issue, this approach would be so fundamental. Now, indicators, we have to get there, and you know that Jeffrey Sachs' group has just produced this paper with 100 indicators. Like targets, there's loads of indicators out there. I just don't think that, given that at this point, and we're counting days and hours, as other friends who are in the open working group know, we have 20 days left. And we haven't even started to talk about what the targets or the goals or anything else should be. So 20 days. So the possibility of getting to indicators is exactly 0. And we have countries saying that they don't even want to talk about targets, which means that we're going to end up with about 400 goals. If you don't have a target, everything becomes a goal, right? So we're so far from even getting to a sensible discussion about goals and targets that indicators and hard numbers I really don't see in the mix between now and July. By the end of the process, we will need that. And what countries like Colombia and others that have similar perspectives is that we should ask experts, because it's not just getting the targets, the indicators right, it's knowing that you can actually use them. We need statisticians in the room. Some of the indicators that I can come up with, because they sound poetic and nice, might be incredibly costly to measure, way beyond the capacity of and the value added for my government and for my society. But a statistician will tell me, well, you can tweak and do it this way and actually da-da-da-da. Or if I have somebody from private sector, some geek, who really knows about technology, will say, well, now with mobile phones, we could actually put this app and we can do these amazing... That's the conversation we need to have. So specifically, you've brought in good examples, and that's why I would say that we need this. On implementation, I think that, yes, the Colombian example is interesting. Two things I want to say about that. It really is, as we say in Spanish, by the nails. We're doing it. It's not like we have this full, funding and we have this whole methodology. We just said, we've come up with this, let's try it on for Scythe. And it took off all by itself. It's become much, much bigger. It's had this snowball effect. And so that's why we know we're right. And I say this because some countries might feel, oh, well, Colombia's been doing this for 3 years. And so, we haven't. We really and truly haven't. We started doing this exercise last October or September, last September. So we've been at it for a very short time. We've had about, 6 or 7 meetings. But it's catalyzed a lot of discussions between ministries. So yes, it's incredibly relevant. We're trying to document it. I film it. I've taken testimonials from people. We take lots of pictures because we do think eventually it would be really useful to roll it out. But I just don't have the capacity to tell the story better or in more depth than I have here. But if anybody, anybody who wants to talk to me and come to Colombia and see what we're doing and see how you can actually structure into more of a process, it's fine. But the message here is that it's not some highly technified, complicated thing. It really is, we're flying by the seat of our pants.
I think also on the issue on indicators, part of it is the bottom up. And so
yeah, absolutely.
There is actually really crucial, and it may not be that it's all done by 2015, that's an ongoing process of which experts play a role, but also conversations at the national community level.
Thanks a lot, Alexander Müller from the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, another German. This institute is headed by Klaus Töpfer, who was responsible for the Rio 92 conference. 2 brief comments/questions. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Do we need kind of a priority in the targets? Would like to use your target on nutrition, reduce the number of stunting and anemia by children. Do we need some guiding targets where all the other targets have to contribute to? Because my experience, I worked 8 years in the UN, in the FAO, is that these very nice cross-cutting targets could be used in the implementation to fall back into the silo approach. So we need kind of guiding targets, reduce stunting of children, that all the other sectors have to work towards and not go back into we have to produce more food and in the end we will finally achieve this target. So what about priorities? Second issue is related to what Joachim von Braun said, the question of implementation and governance. This is a very challenging, comprehensive and complex structure. How do we find a way to monitor it and to do some to implement some governance so that in the end we really achieve these cross-cutting issues? So priority and governance.
Can I answer that quickly? Because I can't keep that many questions in my head at this point. On the priorities, the thing is that it gets really complicated. I mean, your priority is somebody else's non-priority. I've received very good brochures on road safety, and there's some delegations that think that that should be the priority. Others might say, well, road safety is not the priority is this. You also get into, because it's a universal agenda, countries will say, well, it's a priority to talk about SCP, sustainable consumption and production. Other countries feel very uncomfortable with SCP and say, we don't really want to talk about SCP. This is sort of an enabler, and it's so even prioritizing, I think, is a very difficult exercise in an intergovernmental setting. I don't see how that can happen. But the other side of the coin is that if we really understand the targets outside of the silo approach with this broader mentality, childhood stunting becomes an issue for the Ministry of Finance and for the Ministry of Commerce, because you start to understand that if I don't invest in childhood, I'm not going to have a good workforce 20 years down the line. And in Colombia, we've understood that there's actually a whole program that I can give you information about on what we call primary infancy. And it's become, it's really become a hallmark globally for the work that we're doing there, because we've gotten it. We understood that bit. So if you really understand, if you take off the gray glasses and put on, the multi-whatever glasses, you start to understand that the targets belong to much more than one sector, like the example I gave of the formalization. Was that the question? Did I get that? Is there another? Oh, the governance. It's a difficult question, but that's why we need a core set. That's where the dashboard comes in, because if you have a core set of goals, targets, and associated indicators, then it becomes more feasible to provide capacity building for people to develop apps, to identify how you can measure it. We can collectively come up with good mechanisms for monitoring, for accountability. When it's very dispersed, or when you end up with goal statements and goal statements and goal statements and a couple of targets, that you can't monitor.
Okay, Mary Gilbert, Quaker Earth Care Witness. I'm not German, and I'm not a scientist. My question has to do with rights. I've been following quite closely the Open Working Group, and have been very persuaded by those who talk about a rights-based approach to the whole thing. In your dashboard model, which is very exciting, I don't see any place where subsidiarity is played out. So I'd like to hear your comments on that, and also about the suggested goal of the 100 measures on the subjective report of well-being. Does that have any place, could that come out of this dashboard approach?
Okay, I'm not really sure what you mean by the subjective approach. We've been following with great interest Bhutan's experience and work on the happiness index, that's really why we talk about not just poverty but well-being, and we're very careful not to use the word prosperity, because prosperity has a whole nother level of meaning and connotations. Well-being, ideally, if we get the metrics right, as you start to be able to use more of a multidimensional understanding. And by the way, I have to say this parenthetically, we're at an amazing juncture, because the UN Statistical Commission, all governments have already agreed to the new system, the SEEA. And when UN Stats looks at these presentations, they say, yes, please, governments, approve this now. We can hit the ground running. We can help you do this. So the capacity is already in place, and the frameworks have been agreed, and there's now more work doing at ecosystem level to start to have a more multidimensional take on things. In Colombia, we're looking at the multidimensional poverty index, because we understand that poverty has to do with multiple deprivations and the multiple deprivations and not just an income. So within that, you can actually start to factor in more, if you will, subjective understandings or approximations to well-being and to prosperity at a national level, or within different communities or constituencies. I don't see that within the UN system we're going to end up with any kind of a happiness indicator per se, but all of this does give you, by having a more multidimensional approach, you can start to factor in other considerations. And your first question was, remind me, sorry, I slept 3 hours last night, so my retentive capacities.
The request from many sides, rights-based approach.
Sorry. That's again a very political discussion. There's many, for example, in G77 that talk about the need to focus more on access, not what will really deliver the goods. Is it to have a rights-based approach, or is it to talk about percentages of population that have access, and how you actually have the mechanisms in place to ensure that access, and close monitoring to see what percentage have access. A big concern linked up with that is what I call entrenched poverty. That what you really, whether you call it rights-based or access or whatever, what you're talking about is getting to those pockets of poverty that the tyranny of the average height. And really starting, so what you need there is far more than just rights-based or access. I think you need to have a very big emphasis on creating the capacity for disaggregated data. So the question that you would ask is, what are you trying to do? Because I think we're going to get caught in this really political discussion about whether it's rights-based or access, or what are we trying to do? With this, really, all we're saying is, let's be really practical. What are we trying to do? What will make a difference? What will make it revolutionary? What will bring about that huge transformation in this very small window that we have? Because, there's so many thresholds that we are about to surpass, or probably have surpassed decades ago and didn't even realize it. how can we get to deliver that? And probably of something functional like disaggregated data might be even more effective at getting to those that we're trying to get to. So that's going to be a very political discussion in New York. As I say, unpack it and see how we actually deliver the goods on the ground.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's the amount of time we have for this particular session. I'd like you to show your appreciation of Paula and her insights.